One of our major stories this week has been the hack at two major Canadian banks, BMO and CIBC. It's Simplii Financial. Hackers acquiring personal information, holding it for ransom, and threatening to make it public if the banks didn't pay about $1 million. And of course, as we've been reporting through this week, they have begun to release some of that information, making good on their threats. What was the personal information? Well, it included things like this: personal security questions, SIN numbers, dates of birth. Lots of moves taken by the two financial institutions to customers announced yesterday, things like freezing accounts, offering free credit, surveillance to make sure nobody's using your account information inappropriately. But there are a lot of questions about what happens, how this happens, whoever would want that data, what do you do next? So, you know, when this kind of thing happens, we put those questions to Matthew Braga, who's our senior technology reporter here at CBC and has been doing some writing on this, which I'll tell you about. It's online, but an important piece. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. Okay, the hackers said when they talked about this, because they were public about that they'd done this, and they said how easy it was to access this information. How would they get their hands on this kind of sensitive info?
So there's a range of different kind of things, right? I mean, people have probably heard of ATM skimmers, gas pump skimmers, people making modifications to the keypads or the little thing you stick your card into to try and get your information. That's one way. Up from there, I mean, things can get a little bit more complex, right? People can install software on the actual credit card readers or debit card readers that you use at restaurants or clothing stores or malls or things like that. And so that sort of gets up to the next step. And then in this case, this week, we're talking about someone actually getting access to remote systems, right? Finding vulnerabilities or holes that they can use to extract financial information from computer systems. In this case, those belonging to BMO and CIBC's Simplii Financial.
Right.
And then, of course, everyone's familiar with sort of phishing attacks and sort of getting you to install malware, tricking you to sort of providing your credentials to people who try to harvest that sort of thing. So a range of different ways.
And then we know, so they had 90,000 customers' data, which they were wanting to sell. Well, they were holding it for ransom, but then they were going to release it, they said, if they didn't get paid, to criminals, that there had been criminal interest. Who would buy this stuff?
So there are a bunch of sort of communities online where people make a business of buying and selling this stuff, right? There's people who acquire this information because they want to sort of sell it for money laundering purposes. There's people who buy this information because they want to be able to make fraudulent charges on, you know, maybe relatively benign stuff, maybe sort of services and things online that they don't want to, maybe they don't have the money for themselves, maybe they don't want it as traceable back to them, and so they use other cards for it. It's interesting. I mean, some of these sort of marketplaces are quite available. You can find them online. You can access them.
Really? It's not deep dark web?
So we get there, right? So you have some sort of, you know, some of the lower level ones, right, where, you know, maybe they're publicly accessible, but a lot of the information has been repackaged. It's been released in the past. It's being resold. Maybe a lot of the cards are low quality. They've been already flagged for fraud, or they've been shut down, and they're a lot cheaper. But then you kind of start getting up into, there's communities that are perhaps password protected, or you have to sign up, or you have to be invited, or you need to pay some sort of initiation fee or be vetted to be allowed in. And then, as you say, you mentioned the dark web, right? There's some of these sites that you can only access by going to the dark web and pointing your computer in that direction. And then that's kind of where we start getting into some of perhaps the higher quality cards, so to speak.
Okay, so people really wanting that information. Bottom line is, it's there, it's readily available to anybody who might want that kind of personal data.
Generally speaking, we don't know if in this case that it's been released so far. But,
sorry, yes, but but again, it comes back to the question I think I ask you every time. I mean, what do you do if you are if your information is out there? What do you do in terms of protection against this kind of thing?
I mean, it's tough, right? If you are a client of one of these companies, or just in general, your financial information is online. I mean, you can do the basic sort of stuff. You can change your passwords. You can ask for new cards, new account numbers. Maybe go in for credit monitoring, which I know some of the banks are offering in this case. But really, the onus, I think, kind of ends up falling on sort of the companies that are sort of responsible for this data, right? You have some companies opting to, there's sort of this sort of flourishing market for so-called essentially monitoring, right? There's these companies that monitor either sort of dark web markets where cards are bought and sold, or sort of these markets more generally, and they'll sort of say to companies, hey, you know, when you learn that there's a breach, when you learn that perhaps your data has been obtained, we can help you keep an eye on where this, you know, places where this data might pop up. The idea there being that you can be more proactive about identifying places where the information is being bought and sold, rather than waiting for someone to actually buy the card, try to use it, try to put some fraudulent charges. So being a little bit more proactive in that case. But I mean, ultimately, it's sort of like once the information is out there, it's kind of out there. And so, you know, you can sort of change your numbers and things like that and flag them for fraud, but there's not a ton that you can do.
Well, that's a disquieting note on which to conclude. Thank you for coming in.